having an uncle as vice president is really interesting. It's interesting for your identity. And as a young person, I was very much shaped by that. And a lot of people in our family were. And I think one of the things is that you assume some position of privilege when anything like that happens. And the challenge is realizing that it's completely undeserved by you. And so to realize that you occupy a position of privilege, but somehow separate yourself from it, that was something that I think a lot of people in our family had to deal with over years. And then, of course, he left in 1992.
Welcome to Sterling Insights, Stand Out and Supercharge Your Assets, the go-to podcast for financial advisors aiming to grow their assets under management, stand out in a crowded market, and retain assets nearly forever. Are you advising high net worth clients who own appreciated capital assets? Do you want to help them sell without losing a quarter, a third, or even more of their hard-earned profits to capital gains taxes? Then this podcast is tailored for you. Each episode brings you the latest strategies and expert advice from leading financial advisors, seasoned attorneys, and experienced CPAs. Learn how to maximize your clients' wealth, minimize their taxes, and supercharge your advisory practice with actionable insights. Join us on Sterling Insights, Stand Out and Supercharge Your Assets, where you'll gain the knowledge and tools to set yourself apart and achieve unparalleled success in wealth management. Subscribe now and empower your practice for a brighter, more prosperous future. Welcome to Sterling Insights, Stand Out and Supercharge Your Assets. I'm your host, Roger Silk. I'm excited today to have a special guest, Jamie Bush. Jamie grew up as a member of that Bush family, and I'm sure he'll talk to us about that. His uncle was president, his cousin was president, and he'll tell us more about some lesser known and amusing anecdotes from that. Jimmy came to Boston in 1973, and he spent much of his time, both professionally and non-professionally, helping poor people in the city and around in the state. He's been involved somewhat in local politics, but by his family's standards, he's not political. He's very involved in nonprofit activities. He's a graduate of Boston College, where he met his wife, Sue. He is accredited by the American College of Financial Planning Services, and he has a focus on special needs, family businesses, retirement planning, and life insurance. He holds a number of designations, and he is also a registered investment advisor and is licensed under Series 6 and 63. And Jamie, I'm sure I missed a whole bunch of other stuff, but we can talk about all that. Welcome. We're very happy to have you.
Roger, I've loved working with you this last year, and it's great to be here. Thanks.
Thank you. So, Jamie, I know I was working with you for quite a while before I had any idea that Bush was related to either of the Georges, which I think is a testament to you. It never came up. You never made a deal of it. And maybe it's also a comment on how blind I am, because you do bear a little bit of family resemblance. Maybe you could just start by giving our listeners just kind of an overview of the Bush family, even like how is the first President Bush related to the second? I mean, most people know that he's his father, but that's not where you guys started, or your family started in politics, right? Your great-grandfather was a U.S. Senator, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe you could start there.
Well, yeah, I grew up in Greenwich, Connecticut. My grandfather, Prescott Bush, was a U.S. Senator, failed in his first run, succeeded in his second in 1952, and was in the Senate from Connecticut from 1952 to 1962. and overlapped with President Kennedy and President Eisenhower in the other order. Growing up, I was 7 when he got out of the Senate, when he retired because he had a heart condition. But he was just a wonderful grandfather. My grandparents lived in Gwinnett, and we saw them all the time. It didn't really occur to me that being in the Senate was a big deal. He was extremely humble, and it was just part of what he did. He was also a partner before that and after that at Brown Brothers Harriman, which is a significant private bank on Wall Street. And in 1975, I had found myself in Boston, and as a 20-year-old, I ended up going to work for Kevin White, who was the mayor of Boston and ran for re-election for his 3rd term in 1975. And I got bitten by the political bug. And I met my wife, Sue, at BC, as you said. And right after he graduated, she went to work for Senator Brooke, who was a U.S. Senator from Massachusetts. And then at our wedding in 79, we happened to get married inadvertently on Inauguration Day. But my Uncle George was there and Aunt Bar. And we realized that he was running for president. He'd been a former director of the CIA and ambassador to the United Nations and ambassador to China and head of the Republican Party during Watergate. In addition to that, he was a congressman during the 60s for 2 terms from Houston, Texas. You know, it had been there, but it wasn't really a significant presence in our lives. When he ran for president, that was a little different. And I spent a lot of time, as did everyone in our family, extended family, in New Hampshire and Connecticut, Indiana, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, wherever there were primaries. And which was really bad for business because I was just starting out. I'd only gotten into the business in 1978, right after graduation from BC. And I'll tell you about why I did that. But I was so intrigued by the campaign that I spent very little time selling insurance. Then he got whomped in the 1980 primaries by Ronald Reagan. In spite of my best efforts, the public overlooked that and voted overwhelmingly for Reagan, who then picked George Bush to be his running mate, and then he won. So suddenly we were spending time in and around the White House, though at the vice president's house, but occasionally at the White House, like for Inauguration Day and so forth. And then 1984 and then 1988, he ran for the presidency again. And he won with a resounding victory over my governor, Michael Dukakis. And by that time, we were really in it. You know, having an uncle as vice president is really interesting. It's interesting for your identity. And as a young person, I was very much shaped by that. A lot of people in our family were. And I think one of the things is that you assume some position of privilege when anything like that happens. And the challenge is realizing that it's completely undeserved by you. And so to realize that you occupy a position of privilege, but somehow separate yourself from it, that was something that I think a lot of people in our family had to deal with over years. And then, of course, he left in 1992, was not reelected. And then in 2000, my cousin George was elected, and that was a surprise, just to have another person in your family get elected president. But so that's kind of some of the backstory.
So you would have been early 30s in 1980?
I was born in 1955. In 1980, then I would have been 25.
25. All of a sudden, your uncle's vice president of the United States. So what was that like? When people meet you, did they know, oh, Bush, isn't he vice president?
Well, in Massachusetts, even in Massachusetts, people knew that he was vice president. Massachusetts is a little left of center. One of the things is that when you suddenly have a name like that, because of your uncle or whoever it is, and you have that name ID, as it's called, then people, if you're not really ugly or really stupid, and apparently I'm neither, then people begin to say, if you've been around the political scene for a few years, which I had then, when are you going to run for office? And so you begin to think, well, why wouldn't I run for office? Because you begin to think that you're all that. And so I got involved in the Republican Party very locally and then on the state level, just in the Republican State Committee, which is the governing body of the party in each state. I thought about running for Congress. If my name was Smith, I don't know if I ever would have thought of running for Congress. So I don't know. I don't know if I'm answering your question, Roger, but it's life-changing. Even if I'd been in Nashville and part of the Bush Bean family, it's life-changing to have your name mean something to other people. And then you kind of have to create your own identity at some point, or you live with that other identity that other people give you, whatever it is.
Right. Are you guys related to the Bush Beans people?
No, we're all named No Money. They've got a lot of money. Those beans are really good.
They are. And you guys don't have the C in your name, so I know you're not the St. Louis family.
No, they'll be just named.
So how did you, I mean, as I know we've talked about this a little bit, I think you mentioned once that you also thought about running for lieutenant governor at some point. Well, has there always been this tension between politics and business for your focus?
Well, when I was a junior at Boston College, I'd been involved in the White campaign, and my father and I were playing golf one day, and he said, "What are you going to do this summer?" And thinking of my grandfather, who had been on Wall Street and in the Senate, I had been thinking I'd like to do an internship on Wall Street. And I told him that. And he said, I was hoping that he would help arrange it because he had an office on Wall Street also. And he said, I don't think of you and money. I think of you and people. Have you ever thought about the life insurance business? And I hadn't. But when I asked him why, he said, because I think someday you may run for office. And if you've been in that business for 10 or 15 years, you're going to know a lot of people. If you've done a good job for them, they will trust you and they will support you if you run. And I thought that was interesting. I did some exploration and looked at a whole lot of different companies and ended up going to work for MassMutual here because I thought they had the best training program. And 10 years in, I actually had begun to get some traction. It felt like with his being elected in 88, it felt as if I could run for Congress and have a shot at it. I ended up starting a project in the inner city, ironically, as a means of creating a public identity for myself beyond being George Bush's nephew. That project was so time consuming, it didn't any possibility of running for anything except running home at the end of the day. And
people who've never done it don't have a clue how time consuming and all consuming these nonprofit projects can be.
This was definitely one of those do not do this at home projects where we adopted the fourth grade of a school in Dorchester in Boston and promised to pay their college tuition. There were 111 kids, and we promised to walk with them until they graduated from high school and then college, and put together an infrastructure, make sure that they did, and so forth. But anyway, in 2003, that program called I Have a Dream, which Sue called I Had a Nightmare, because of the logistical challenges, that ended. And Mitt Romney was going to run for governor, and there was no clear lieutenant governor candidate. And so my wife suggested that I run for lieutenant governor. And so I came within an inch of doing that and then pulled back at the last minute.
In Massachusetts, are the governor and lieutenant governor coordinated? You have to coordinate with the gubernatorial candidate?
Yeah, it's not like Texas where the lieutenant governor can be a Republican and the governor can be a Democrat.
Yeah, so you had a number of conversations with Romney about that?
Mm-hmm.
Was he in Boston because wasn't he running Bain in those days?
He ran Bain. He brought Bain pretty much out of bankruptcy in the late 70s and early 80s, and just brilliant guy. And then he ran for the Senate in, I think, 1994 against Ted Kennedy. He was a terrible candidate. And it was his first time running for office. Mitt Romney could do anything up to that point, and he got a little ahead of himself. Ted Kennedy, turns out, was pretty good at what he did. and he had pretty good people around him who knew politics. Mitt knew everything but politics. When he ran for governor, he had a much better team, and he had a much weaker opponent, and he ended up being a tremendous governor. But I was not his lieutenant governor.
Right. What tipped the balance in you deciding not to make that run?
Well, it's kind of a funny story. I decided to explore it, and I met with a friend who was the editor of the Boston Herald, who said, well, let's plant something in Monday morning's paper. I had an interview with the political editor then that Sunday night. And so there was a little squib on the front page of the Herald saying that Jamie Bush, who was kin to George Bush, I think it said, this is George W. Bush, was thinking about running for lieutenant governor. So that's all it took. And I got a dozen or more calls from media outlets, from USA Today to the AP to WGBH and all the local stations. So I did about a dozen interviews that day, and I felt pretty good about it. And I'd been talking with Ken Nealman, the political director of the White House, for about 2 weeks to be sure that it would not be in any way getting in the way of my cousin, who, as president of the United States, was prosecuting a war he was certainly prosecuting a war against terrorism. And my cousin Jeb was governor of Florida, his brother. And we didn't want to do anything that would spur more conversation about a Bush dynasty if I won, because that wouldn't be helpful to anybody. And we never thought of ourselves that way. And on the other hand, if I lost, we didn't want it to have a deleterious impact on my cousin or his political fortunes. You can't even support your own cousin who's running for lieutenant governor in Massachusetts, kind of thing. But they came back finally and said, all right, we've talked about it and we wish you well. We will support you if you win a primary. Otherwise, we'll be quiet until you get through the primary.
George and Jeb?
No, we being the White House political team and my
White House political
President George, who just, passed on it. And it would be unlike anyone in their family to stand in the way of somebody else. But I really wanted to make sure that we weren't doing something that would be hurtful in any way. So I didn't have to run, but I had been thinking about it for 25 years. Anyway, we go through all these interviews, and I've been feeling pretty good about it. And I'm on my way home, and the phone rings, and it's Ken Nealman for the White House. And he says, hey, Jamie, Ken, just got a quick question for you. I know you're busy, but is this something you have to do? And I said, no. But nobody had ever asked me that question. Is this something you have to do? It had been a seed planted by my father back in 1976, and it grown and grown and grown. And of course, uncle and then cousin and then others involved in politics in our family. It felt like I did have to do it. It was almost like a genetic defect. Well, when he asked me the question, it was such a blessing because I realized, wait, you don't have to do this. Just because you might win doesn't mean, because it looked pretty good. The Romney opponent was a terrible opponent. Nobody in the Democratic Party even liked her. So it looked like I'd have to shoot him and me to lose, but in the foot, theoretically. But by the time I said, no, Ken, I don't. And he said, that's great. Good to talk to you. Well, a very short conversation. By the time I got home, about 15 minutes later, I realized, wait a minute, what am I doing? I have 2 kids in high school and college. We have spent so much time doing other things. We're not independently wealthy. We've done so much stuff doing this I Have a Dream program and other things that have evolved out of that with relations with people in the inner city and the suburbs and so forth, that we weren't in a strong financial position. You're not supposed to make a lot of money in politics. Our business had survived the 90s as opposed to thriving. And so when I walked in, Sue said, Jamie, you're on ABC. You look great. Come sit down. And I said, honey, not going to run. And she was like, who are you and what have you done with my husband? That's the end of that. So I realized actually that a lot of the stuff that had happened in my life that might have made me a good candidate, might even have made me a good public servant, was there for other reasons and just not for me necessarily.
So for you, was that decision was the end of the political bug for you?
Not the end of the bug, but there was a cure for it.
Uh,
I can't, every now and then I'm looking around me today. Roger, you probably feel the same way. Anybody who's graduated from college today probably thinks they could do a better job. Actually, people who graduated from elementary school do a better job than some of our public servants.
I'm sorry. It's a lot harder than it looks. So just very quickly, Jamie, I bet a lot of people kind of wonder, like, what does a lieutenant governor do? Is he governor in waiting, like they say the vice president is?
Yeah, next question. I mean, there's nothing to say about the lieutenant governorship. You know, Ronald Reagan made George Bush actually, Jimmy Carter made Walter Mondale a big part of his administration. That was the first time that had happened in practically in history. Vice presidents had been pretty much a pain in the neck, just in the way. Same thing with lieutenant governors.
We all know what John Nance Garner said about it, about the vice presidency.
Oh, it's not worth a bucket of spit.
My dad always told me they clean that up.
Yeah.
He was a Texan, wasn't he, Garner?
He what?
I think he was a Texan, unlikely to have said warm bucket of spit.
Sounds like a Texan.
So after the non-run for lieutenant governor, you kind of focus more on the business. Is that where your main focus has been since then?
With a number of important distractions.
So one thing that I did want to ask you about that I've heard from you and I've heard from some others, but I've heard very little of that your uncle, first President Bush, by several accounts, actually had a very sharp sense of humor.
He was, I would say, Lincoln might be the only contestant in that race for funniest president. Lincoln was famously extraordinarily dry. My uncle was hilarious. There's a book called that his chief of staff for the 25 years or so after he left the White House just put together last year called Character Matters. And there's a story in it that if this was just about George Bush, I would read to you. It is about how Prince Bandar, the Saudi ambassador to the United States for about 25 years or longer, but covering the period during which my uncle was vice president and president. They were very good friends, and he was rumored to be having been assassinated by the Syrians. And so Gene Becker, his chief of staff, George's chief of staff, had been in touch with a lot of people, and they had come to the conclusion that Prince Bandar had been, in fact, killed. And so it fell to her to tell my uncle. And so she was sitting outside at Kennebunk Court. I'll tell you the story quickly, with him doing some work. And she said, Mr. President, I'm sorry, I have to tell you that so-and-so and so-and-so think that that Prince Bandar has been assassinated by the Syrians. And he thought for a minute and he said, well, Jean, did you think to call him? And she said that would be no. And so he says, call him. And so she yells upstairs to an aide, hey, Chris, get Prince Bandar. And he leans out the window and says, did you tell him? And she says, yeah, I told him, get him on the phone. And so 4 or 5 minutes later, he yells out the window, Prince Bandar on line 1. And so he picks it up and he says, Bandar, there's a rumor, people think you're dead. what is it? Are you dead or alive? And he turns to Jean and says, he's alive. She says, I got that. He talks to Bandar, and then he calls Jim Baker and Brent Scowcroft, his national security advisor, who are also very close to him, and tells them that he's alive. And then he turns to Jean and says, Jean, sometimes with these things, it's pretty simple. You just got to get them on the phone. And the simple question is, are you dead or alive? But, he was so droll, but he also told Thanksgiving in our house was so hilarious because he and my other two uncles would invariably tell the funniest jokes, and we'd just be rolling. And that's the way it was in the White House.
Because that was so not his public persona.
No, he was a stiff Yankee, and the media didn't want to believe that this guy could be that funny because the media is overwhelmingly Democrat. And it's just sad. It's just the way it is. It's not, no judgment. They just don't think Republicans are funny, and they don't want to believe they're funny.
Yeah. I was surprised because, you knew what I knew from consuming the public information about him. And I was very surprised. And I bet you've got just endless stories like that.
But who you should interview about whether he's funny or not is Dana Carvey. Wouldn't be prudent. And Naga. Just it's funny. I took the train, for some reason, to Washington once when he was president. And a guy got on in Stamford, Connecticut, and we talked until he got off in Baltimore. And when he was getting off, he said, you remind me of somebody. And I said, is that right? And he said, yeah, somebody famous. And I said, oh, no kidding. He said, I got it. You remind me of Dana Carvey. And that is very funny. He gave him a card. And he looked at it and said, oh, that is very funny. But for those of you who don't know, Dana Carvey was best known for his imitation of George Bush. When my uncle lost in 1992, he had Dana Carvey come in to the White House and entertain the staff in between Election Day and Inauguration Day when they would officially leave. They were really depressed. And it was just typical of him. And when his son, George, was running for re-election in 2004, the phone rang in the Carvey household. And Dana picks it up. He says, hello. He said, Dana, George Bush, how you doing? And he's like, wait a minute. It's election night. Aren't you busy? And he said, yeah, just wanted to check on you, though. How are you and your family? Just sort of typical of who he was. And they had a non-funny conversation. He was he was just the most touching person, as well as being very funny. And I thought he was a pretty good president.
It's so interesting to hear you say that, because I would think that the vast majority of us being Americans know, for a lot of our fellow Americans, the first President Bush is history, right? They don't remember him because they weren't alive or they were kids. But even for those of us who do, he was so serious. Like you say, wouldn't be prudent, and I won't eat my broccoli.
Can't blame him.
Yeah. But I have a neighbor who actually is a broccoli broker. So he might have liked President Bush, but he didn't like that particular pronouncement.
Well, I think my aunt, Barbara, was in on the prank that saw thousands and thousands of tons of broccoli delivered by truck from all over the country to the White House to dumped on the South Lawn. She was really annoyed by the whole broccoli thing. It's like, George, give it a rest. No, I'm actually a broccoli fan.
Yeah. So in and around all this, Jimmy, tell me a little bit about how you built your business. Did the family name overall help or hurt, or neither one?
I think it was probably neutral. I think in our business, I started out selling life insurance, and it was a little slow to start because I didn't know any adults when I got out of college. I was still very much a life insurance agent, but I started peddling employee benefits and retirement plans. And then through that, began to meet business owners. And then eventually, after about 10 years, began to do estate planning and had really begun to get traction. Sold a lot of disability insurance, a lot of things that people needed. But nobody's going to buy life insurance from you because of your political affiliation or your last name. Life insurance is hard enough to understand for most people and most agents. And so it wasn't a factor. And again, in Massachusetts, people really don't care. They didn't care then, they don't care now. If I'd been in Texas or Connecticut, there might have been some cachet to being a Bush, but it didn't get in the way either, except in my own head, because I probably thought I was a little more special than I was. But other than that, no, there's no impact.
Did your clients care that you're a part of that family?
I don't think so. I think if I was really a jerk, which I sort of go out of my way not to be, then it would be a negative in a big way. But I don't think when I do things right, they don't think it's because he's a Bush.
And I think, I mean, one thing you said a minute ago, which I think, especially a lot of younger people, we hear, I remember when I was in 7th grade, 8th grade, this teacher who was, teacher in a public junior high school, and therefore knew everything, offered the timeless wisdom that it's not what you know, it's who you know, which I have found to be profoundly misleading at best. But it's interesting, no one ever heard my name, but it's interesting to me to hear you say essentially the same thing. You could be literally the nephew of the president of the United States, and you, quote, didn't know anybody.
I think there's a more important saying, which is people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care.
I agree.
I think in the life insurance business, when you're doing financial and estate planning for people, for a lot of people, their money is more personal than there's a trust factor involved that I think stems a great deal from how much people think you care about them. And I think one of the reasons that I love the business is that my parents and most people in our family really care deeply about people. And, it's a natural place to be because in our business, you have to know what drives people, what's important to them. And if what's important to them is important to you and it's obvious to them, then they may not want to buy what you're selling, but ultimately they want to spend more time with you and hear what you're saying.
How did your father and your mother, we talked a lot about your grandfather and your more distant relatives, but I'm sure that talked a little bit about your dad, and he seems to have had a pretty profound influence on you. And tell us a little bit about him and a little bit about your mom.
Well, mom's actually more interesting. Her father was an admiral in the Navy during World War One. Well, he wasn't an admiral in World War One, but he served in the Navy in World War One. He was an admiral in the Pacific and the Atlantic in World War Two. She had a brother who was 10 or 11 years older who went to the Naval Academy and then ended up joining the French-American Ambulance Corps when World War II broke out, and he was taken prisoner in France behind enemy lines by the Germans, and then ended up going to England when he escaped from the concentration camp. And he ended up being part of a core group of people who started the unexploded bomb units to defuse bombs that were all over London and the British countryside. And they had blown up. And so he got sent back to the United States. He was already a member of the Royal Navy. And He hadn't joined the United States Navy because we were in a period of isolationism when he graduated from the academy. And so they were only commissioning the top third of his class. Anyway, long story short, he ended up starting the Navy SEALs during World War II and was later superintendent of the Naval Academy. Had an extraordinary career. So that was Mom. Mom was extremely well traveled with a father who was a captain and then an admiral in the Navy. She lived in 14 different schools by the time she graduated from high school. She was a poet and a philosopher, not published. She was just, that's who she was. And my father was the, what do you call it? Outgoing, begins with an E. I was raised as an extrovert like my father, but it took me about 30 years to realize that I'm actually an introvert like my mother. Dad went into the insurance business with Johnson and Higgins, which when he retired was the largest privately owned insurance brokerage in the world. I didn't know what he did, even though when he suggested I go into the life insurance business, I thought Dad was just a businessman. Had an office at 95 Wall Street, took the 612 train from Greenwich every morning into the city and came home around 7 o'clock or later every night. Was involved in Connecticut politics, ran my grandfather's campaign for the Senate and his second campaign. He ran Connecticut for my Uncle George. He was a wonderful, wonderful guy. He served on boards of Greenwich Hospital, American Red Cross. They got involved in Portchester, New York, which is next to Greenwich, and downtown Portchester is about 25% unemployment chronically for decades. And they got involved and created something called the Greenwich Committee for Carver Center because there was this place that was a community center there that helped the poor in Portchester. And they were doing great stuff. And so Mom and Dad tapped their friends in Greenwich to raise money for it, which was a great illustration for me. You know, when you see people doing good things, then you want to be there. You want to go towards that flame, whatever it is. That's who Mom and Dad were. They were always helping people.
Well, the apple didn't fall far from the tree. It kind of brings me to one of these canned questions that I often ask, which is, I think I may be able to guess it, but I want you to give me your view is, like, what is success to you?
You know, that's a great question to ask anyone, Roger. And I think it's a question that we routinely ask our clients of all ages. Most people have not been asked that question. I think that basically success for me is if I am able to use the natural gifts, whatever they are, that God has given me for his purposes, which probably means serving other people and helping them maximize their own resources and their own gifts, whatever their time, talent, and treasure are for the better of the world around them, then I feel as if we've done something important. So that we try to keep our focus on that.
Unfortunately, I'm sure you and I could keep talking for the rest of the afternoon here, but we do have a time limit. Is there something particular that you want to share that hasn't come up yet? I know we haven't talked about far more than we have, but is there anything particular that you'd like to share?
You know, the heart of our practice is purpose-driven planning. And it's something that I find a lot of advisors miss the opportunity to help their clients think about what their purpose is and how to think about charitable giving as something that will give them, they being the client, a more abundant life. And if you can help people enrich their own lives by giving away something that may have become dear to them, you're really giving them a gift. And charitable giving has become a bigger and bigger part of our practice, not as an agenda, but just because we see that it really helps people find more richness in their lives. The clients who we've introduced you to, who put a significant part of their oil deal into a charitable remainder trust, are thrilled with all that is going to mean for them after they sell this thing. And no one had ever suggested anything like it. And he wishes that we'd known him when he sold his business 4 or 5 years ago, because he would love to put part of his business in it. And that's something that we've recommended to others that they think about. So anyway, I think whatever your business, when you start thinking outside of yourself and how other people's lives could be improved by thinking outside of themselves, it all gets to be more fun.
Jimmy, with all your success, what do you find now is your biggest challenge?
I think I've always found that my greatest challenge is staying focused. It's too easy for me to see an opportunity to do something really interesting and to actually go overboard sometimes in helping a client or somebody who isn't a client, someone I've just met, realize some opportunity for themselves, that I spend maybe too much time doing things that aren't related to our business. I guess let's in the next 10 years, I'd love to be more successful at growing our business, because my partner is my son-in-law, who I love, and is married to my daughter, who I adore. He joined me 10 years ago, and I'd love the business to be as successful as it can be for them, because they're extremely charitable also with their lives. So I'd love to see them succeed even more. They don't really need me, but it would be great to see that happen.
Right. Yeah. No, we really enjoy working with Drake as well. And maybe next time I'm out, I can meet the rest of the family. By the way, speaking of which, my wife and my daughter say hello.
Give them my best. They're responsible for women.
Thank you. Jimmy, where can our audience go to learn more about you and your firm?
Well, I'd like them to wait a month to go to bushandcompany.com, www.bushandcompany.com. We're going to improve it in the next month or so, but if they go there today, they will still find out what we do.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Jamie. It's really a pleasure, and I very much appreciate it.
Roger, it's always good to see you, even online, and wish you all a wonderful, stress-free, sane holiday.
Thank you very much, and the same to you.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Sterling Insights, Stand Out and Supercharge Your Assets, where we provide the info you need from successful leading financial advisors, lawyers, and CPAs. Your hosts, Roger and Catherine Silk, invite you to learn more about Sterling Foundation Management by visiting sterlingfoundations.com.